What would you do if, after sacrificing more than 3 years of your life for the freedom of your country, you returned home and discovered that no one believed it was you? Think about this for a moment. Robert Hayes, a young farmer from Ashland, Montana, slept in blood-soaked trenches, watched dozens of his comrades die in his arms, and survived conditions that would kill most men. Can you imagine what was going through his mind during those endless nights? The only light in the darkness, a wild, crumpled photograph in the left pocket of his uniform, a 7 months pregnant wife waiting at home, and a promise repeated silently every night, "I will meet my son." But what happened when Robert finally set foot again on American soil was something so devastating, so unexpected, that military doctors called it one of the most extraordinary cases ever documented, something that affected only a rare minority of veterans, but changed their lives forever. Have you ever wondered what is the deepest pain a human being can feel? Worse than any physical injury, more devastating than any material loss. The story I'm going to share today has been carefully hidden from mainstream newspapers. The United States War Department classified these cases as exceptional situations, filed in folders that were only released decades later. That morning in 1945, as Robert adjusted his uniform in front of the house he built with his own hands, his heart beat at a rhythm that not even the battlefront could provoke. 3 deep breaths like he did before each mission, 2 loud knocks on the door, a significant pause and a final knock, the family code he'd used since he was a teenager. For long seconds, absolute silence. Then, footsteps slowly approaching. The doorknob turned, and when that door opened, what Robert saw in the eyes of the person in front of him was something no amount of military training could have prepared him for. This is just the beginning of a story that has made countless people completely rethink the meaning of identity and belonging. The next few minutes will change the way you view every veteran you encounter for the rest of your life. Keep watching until the end, because the decision Robert made, which you'll discover in the last moments of this video, made military psychologists rethink their protocols and challenged everything we thought we knew about what a human being is capable of enduring. This is the story of a man who faced the hardest battle after the war ended. This is the story that exposes the truth no one tells about America's forgotten heroes. Every like on this video amplifies a voice silenced for decades and honors the memory of veterans who, like Robert, returned to a country that moved forward without them. Tap the like button now and turn this story into a movement of national recognition. The most powerful stories are those shared heart to heart. What would you do if you were in Robert's shoes at that crucial moment? Your response in the comments creates a chain of reflection that helps others process their own losses and rediscoveries. Share your perspective now. You belong to a community that values the uncomfortable truths of history, the ones that make us more human and connected. By subscribing to the channel, you guarantee immediate access to upcoming revelations about war stories that have been deliberately hidden from the American public. Sign up now, because next week we'll reveal what happened to 5 other soldiers who faced even more extraordinary situations upon returning home. What would you do if, after sacrificing more than 3 years of your life for the freedom of your country, you returned home and discovered that no one believed it was you? Think about this for a moment. Robert Hayes, a young farmer from Ashland, Montana, slept in blood-soaked trenches, watched dozens of his comrades die in his arms, and survived conditions that would kill most men. Can you imagine what was going through his mind during those endless nights? The only light in the darkness? A crumpled photograph in the left pocket of his uniform, a 7 months pregnant wife waiting at home, and a promise repeated silently every night. "I will meet my son." But what happened when Robert finally set foot again on American soil was something so devastating, so unexpected, that military doctors called it one of the most extraordinary cases ever documented, something that affected only a rare minority of veterans, but changed their lives forever. Have you ever wondered what is the deepest pain a human being can feel? Worse than any physical injury, more devastating than any material loss. The story I'm going to share today has been carefully hidden from mainstream newspapers. The United States War Department classified these cases as exceptional situations, filed in folders that were only released decades later. That morning in 1945, as Robert adjusted his uniform in front of the house he built with his own hands, his heart beat at a rhythm that not even the battlefront could provoke. 3 deep breaths, like he did before each mission, 2 loud knocks on the door, a significant pause, and a final knock, the family code he'd used since he was a teenager. For long seconds, absolute silence. Then, footsteps slowly approaching. The doorknob turned, and when that door opened, what Robert saw in the eyes of the person in front of him was something no amount of military training could have prepared him for. This is just the beginning of a story that has made countless people completely rethink the meaning of identity and belonging. The next few minutes will change the way you view every veteran you encounter for the rest of your life. Keep watching until the end, because the decision Robert made, which you'll discover in the last moments of this video, made military psychologists rethink their protocols and challenged everything we thought we knew about what a human being is capable of enduring. This is the story of a man who faced the hardest battle after the war ended. But before I reveal what happened when that door opened, you need to understand who Robert Hayes was. The man behind the uniform, the son, the husband, the father he never had the chance to be. Because only then will you understand the size of the loss he was about to discover that morning. Robert was no different from thousands of young Americans, born into a farming family in Ashland, Montana. He grew up harvesting wheat and breaking horses with his father, but there was something special in her eyes, a quiet determination, a strength that not even her parents fully understood. Since he was little, he saved every penny he earned in a coffee can buried under the oak tree on the property. "To build a house for my family one day," he said when someone asked. At age 22, he met Sarah Miller at the County Harvest Festival. She was wearing a light blue dress that matched her eyes perfectly. The way she laughed, throwing her head back without caring what anyone else thought, let Robert know immediately. 3 months later, they were married, and in less than a year, they had saved enough to buy a piece of land in the western part of the city. The house that Robert built was not large, but every board was cut and laid by his own hands. The blue fences were painted by Sarah as she hummed lullabies to the baby growing in her womb. It was in this same living room, with the smell of paint still fresh on the walls, that Robert opened the telegram that would change everything. "Your country needs you," the official paper said. Remember that determined look Robert always had? It was with that same look that he looked at Sarah, his hands shaking slightly over her 7-month-old belly. "I'll come back," he promised, before his 3rd birthday. "I'll come back and teach our son to ride, to fish, to build things with his own hands." The night before he left, Robert wrote 57 letters, one for each week he would be gone based on the expected length of the war. In each envelope, specific instructions: to be read when you miss me, to be read on his 1st birthday, to be read if the war seems to have no end. Sarah kept them all in a shoebox tied with a ribbon, the same blue as the fences. What Sarah didn't know was that Robert also wrote a letter to his son, a single letter, kept in the pocket Bible he would carry throughout the war. "To my son, when we finally meet." It contained everything a father could want to say, his dreams, his fears, his hopes, and it ended with a promise: "I will come back to you, even if I have to go through hell to do it." And going through hell is exactly what Robert did. The war spared no one its horrors. Indeed, his unit suffered heavy casualties crossing the Rhine. During a particularly brutal ambush in France, Robert was shot 3 times, one in the shoulder, one in the thigh, and another that grazed his neck, just 2 centimeters from the carotid artery. "This man has more lives than a cat," the field medic commented as he extracted the metal fragments. 8 out of 10 men would not survive injuries like these. The night after he was wounded, when the fever made him delirious and the pain was almost unbearable, Robert asked a companion to write a letter to Sarah in case he did not survive. "Tell her my last thought was of our son. Tell her I'm sorry for breaking my promise." But Robert survived, against all odds, against medical logic, against fate that seemed determined to keep him away from home. The last letter he received from Sarah arrived at the end of the war. It was stained with tears and contained only one sentence: "Come back soon. We need you more than you know." Inside the envelope was a small piece of fabric, a piece of the baby's blanket that had been born 3 weeks after Robert's departure. A strong, healthy boy named after his father. Have you ever wondered what really keeps us alive in the darkest of times? For Robert, it was that crumpled photograph in his uniform pocket. Sarah smiling, with her hand on her belly, in front of the blue fences of the house they built together. An image he looked at every night before going to sleep, even in the muddy trenches, even under the deafening noise of the bombings, even when his companions, one by one, stopped breathing beside him. as the end of the war approached and the soldiers began to talk about returning home, Robert became increasingly quiet. He did not participate in conversations about plans for the future. He didn't talk about homecoming parties or family gatherings. He had only one fixed thought: meeting his son, teach him to ride a bike, show you how to fix a broken fence, seeing your face for the first time. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that his son had already learned to walk. I was already speaking in small sentences. I already called another man Daddy. Because while Robert was struggling to survive in Europe, something happened in Ashland, Montana, something that would make that morning of reunion become the cruelest moment a human being could face. And now, let's find out what the first signs were that something was terribly wrong when Robert finally returned home. The train arrived at the Ashland station on a Thursday morning. The sky was exceptionally clear, almost as if nature was celebrating the return of America's children. Robert Hayes stepped onto the platform with his heart racing. His eyes swept anxiously over the small group of people waiting, families with signs, wives with flowers, children waving American flags. But no one expected him. There were no signs with the name Hayes. There was no wife in a blue dress holding a 3-year-old boy. There were no flowers, no hugs, no tears of joy. Just the cold Montana wind and the distant sound of the train whistle that was already leaving for the next town. Strange, thought Robert. Maybe Sarah didn't get my telegram. Communication during the post-war period was still chaotic. Letters were lost. Telegrams took weeks to arrive. He shouldered his backpack and looked around, looking for a familiar face, someone who could give him a ride to his house on the outskirts of town. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. 7 other soldiers had disembarked with him. Each of them was now surrounded by family, drowning in hugs, covered in kisses. A small crowd formed around each uniformed man, except around him. Robert swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump that was beginning to form in his throat. He walked to the main road and stuck out his thumb. A taxi eventually stopped. "Where to, soldier?" asked the driver, a middle-aged man Robert didn't recognize. "Number 147 Ridge Road, the White House with the blue fences," Robert replied, unable to suppress a smile at the thought that in a few minutes he would be home. The driver frowned, looking at him through the rearview mirror with a strange expression. During the 20-minute journey, Robert counted 12 times the driver gave that same confused look in the mirror, as if transporting a ghost. "Are you from Ashland?" Robert asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "I was born and raised here," replied the driver without elaborating. One more look in the rearview mirror. "Me too. The Hayes of the Western Farm. My father was George Hayes." The taxi slowed down, slightly. The man now alternated glances between the road and the rearview mirror with disturbing frequency. "George Hayes," muttered the driver. "Yes, good man. Died 2 years ago, didn't he? Pneumonia." Robert felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "Your father dead?" Sarah hadn't mentioned anything about this in her letters. How could I not have said something so important? Before he could fully process this information, the taxi turned onto Ridge Road. As they approached number 147, Robert's anxiety turned to pure confusion. The house in front of him was not white, it was green, and there were no blue fences. In fact, there were no fences of any kind. "Are you sure it's here?" he asked, unable to hide the concern in his voice. "Number 147 as requested," replied the driver, stopping the car. Robert paid the fare with some of the few bills he had in his pocket and went down slowly, still trying to understand. Maybe he had the wrong number. No, impossible. This was his house. He recognized the large oak tree in the front yard, the peculiar design of the windows he had installed himself, the small porch where he planned to put a rocking chair for summer evenings. But the color was wrong. Fences were absent, and an unknown dog, a German shepherd, barked ferociously at him from the side window. Robert walked through what was once his garden, noticing that the flower beds Sarah loved so much were also gone. As he approached the door, he saw 3 people across the street, the Andersons, neighbors with whom he had dinner at least once a month before the war. He raised his hand to greet them, but something inexplicable happened. The 3 of them turned their heads simultaneously and hurriedly entered the house, as if they had seen a haunting. The lump in his throat now felt the size of a fist. Something was very wrong, terribly wrong. Would Sarah have moved out? Would they have sold the house? But why? And why didn't anyone in town seem happy to see him? Robert stopped in front of the door, breathing deeply to calm the heart that was now hammering in his chest. Perhaps there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Sarah was staying at her parents' house and had rented the property temporarily. Perhaps the dog belonged to the tenants. Perhaps the fences had broken during the harsh winter. Maybe. But deep down, a part of him already knew something was deeply wrong, and what would happen in the next few moments would change his life forever. With his fingers shaking slightly, not from fear like in the trenches, but from an anxiety he had never experienced, Robert adjusted his uniform and prepared to knock on the door that had once been his, at the door behind which his wife and son were supposed to be waiting. What he didn't yet know was that behind that door, there weren't just strangers. There was a truth so cruel, so devastating, that it would make war seem almost a relief in comparison. A truth that was about to be revealed with the simple turn of a doorknob. Robert breathed as he had learned to do before the most difficult battles. 3 deep breaths, one for courage, one for clarity, one for calm. The ritual that had kept him alive as bullets ripped through the air around him now seemed absurdly inadequate for what he was about to face. He instinctively touched the left pocket of his uniform, feeling the cold metal of the ring that should have been on Sarah's finger. He had sent it along with a letter when he knew he would be on the front lines. "Keep it until I get back," he had written. "That way you'll know I'll always come back for you." A romantic gesture that now seemed like a premonition. Time seemed to have slowed down. Robert raised his hand and knocked on the door with the familiar code he had used since their courtship. 2 strong beats, a calculated pause, and a final beat. Sarah would know immediately who was at the door. 8 seconds passed. He counted them as he counted the seconds between seeing the flash of a bomb and hearing it explode. A method for calculating distances, for assessing danger. But what distance was it measuring now? How close was he to the abyss he felt approaching? Finally, steps. Too light to be Sarah's, who always ran around the house barefoot. Something inside him tightened. The doorknob turned excruciatingly slowly. When the door finally opened, Robert felt his entire world freeze. Before him stood a young woman, perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair and eyes that stared at him with complete incomprehension. It wasn't Sarah, not even remotely like Sarah, whose pale skin and blonde hair had been the first thing he'd noticed about her. "Can I help?" asked the woman, examining his uniform curiously but without the slightest sign of recognition. Robert's mouth went dry. The words seemed stuck in his throat, as if his body had already understood what his mind refused to accept. "I am looking for Sarah Hayes," he finally managed, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. This was our home." The woman's expression changed subtly. A shadow of understanding, perhaps even pity, crossed his face. "I'm sorry, but there's no Sarah Hayes here. We bought this house from the Wilson family about 4 months ago." Robert tried to process the information, but it was like trying to understand a foreign language. Wilson? Who were the Wilsons? And where was Sarah? "My name is Robert Hayes," he said, as if that could change anything, as if his name had the power to restore the world to what it should be. "This house, I built it, with my own hands, before I went to war." The woman was now looking at him with a mixture of confusion and alarm. She turned slightly towards the inside of the house. "Henry, can you come here for a minute?" A broad-shouldered man appeared behind her. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and had paint stains on his hands. An artist, perhaps. "What's wrong, sweetie?" "This soldier says he built our house," she explained, her voice low but not low enough for Robert not to hear. "Says he's looking for Sarah Hayes." The man looked at Robert intensely, as if he were trying to solve a complex riddle. "Sarah Hayes," he repeated slowly. "Robert Hayes's wife. She hasn't lived here since—" "Wait, you said you're Robert Hayes?" Robert nodded, a glimmer of hope emerging. Someone who knew him. Someone who knew Sarah. Her husband? The man looked genuinely shocked. "But that's impossible." Robert Hayes died in 1944 in France. The telegram arrived more than a year ago. The word "died" hit Robert like a bullet. He staggered slightly, his hand seeking support on the doorframe. "What telegram?" he managed to ask, his voice little more than a whisper. The man disappeared briefly inside the house, returning with a yellowed envelope that he hesitantly handed to Robert. "We found this when we were renovating the basement. It looks like the Wilsons didn't clean everything out when they moved in. I was planning on taking it to the city museum eventually." With trembling fingers, Robert opened the envelope. The official paper of the United States War Department was there, with their insignia and signatures. His eyes quickly scanned the text until he found the phrase that would destroy his existence. We regret to inform you that Sergeant Robert J. Hayes was killed in action on June 12, 1944, during military operations in France. The world around Robert began to spin. He felt his stomach contract violently. Dead. He was dead. Officially, legally, permanently dead. A ghost wearing a uniform, knocking on the door of a life that no longer existed. It was then that his eyes caught something even more devastating. Behind the couple, hanging on the wall of the living room, the room he had specifically designed to catch the morning light, was a framed portrait, a military portrait, a young man in a uniform with a diagonal black stripe running across the image. The banner that symbolized mourning, which marked the deceased. It was his own face watching him from the wall. Robert felt his legs weaken. The world darkened at the edges, as if looking through an ever-narrowing tunnel. He wasn't just lost. It was off. Deleted. Its entire existence had been overwritten by a bureaucratic error. A piece of paper had stolen his life while he was still breathing. Can you imagine what goes through the mind of a man who discovers he is dead? That his wife received the news of his death, cried for him, mourned him and moved on. That as he fought to survive on distant battlefields, dreaming of the day he would return home, his very existence was being systematically erased in the place that mattered most. The couple now looked at him with a mixture of fear and pity. He must have looked crazy, an imposter, perhaps a war-disturbed man pretending to be someone he wasn't. Do you know where Sarah is now? Robert asked, his voice breaking on the last word. The man and woman exchanged hesitant glances, as if silently debating how much to reveal. I'm sorry, the man said finally. We don't know Mrs. Hayes personally. We only know what the neighbors told us when we moved. Apparently she remarried. Moved to another state, I understand. Robert felt as if he had been shot in the chest. This time, however, there was no field doctor to extract the bullet. There was no morphine to ease the pain. Just the raw, unforgiving, undeniable truth. Sarah had moved on. While he survived hell every day for her, she had buried him. While he kept her photo like a sacred talisman, she was building a new life with another man, elsewhere. And his son, who he never met, would never know who he really was. What would happen now? How could Robert prove he was alive when the government itself had declared otherwise? How would he find Sarah and her son when he didn't even know where they had gone? And most importantly, when you met them, if you met them, what would you say? How could he blame her for something that wasn't his fault? The answers to these questions were about to prove even more devastating than Robert could have imagined, because the next chapter of this story would show that the war had stolen something much more valuable than years of his life. He had stolen his own identity. I'm sorry, but who are you really? The woman's question brought Robert out of his stupor. His eyes were fixed on the portrait on the wall. His own face, young and confident, marked as deceased. It was surreal, like watching his funeral from outside the coffin. I'm Robert Hayes, he replied automatically, his voice distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Sergeant Robert J. Hayes, 101st Airborne Division, serial number 357422619. The words he had been trained to repeat in war now sounded like an echo of a man who no longer existed. The couple exchanged a look full of tension. The woman took a step back, and the man assumed a protective stance. Sir, he said, choosing his words carefully, I don't know who you are or why you are here, but I must ask you to leave. My wife is uncomfortable. Robert blinked, trying to clear his mind. He realized how insane the scene must seem. A stranger in a military uniform, claiming to be someone who had been dead for over a year, appearing on their doorstep. I can prove it, he said desperately, rummaging through his uniform pockets. He found the dispensary license, crumpled photo of Sarah, and the ring. Look, this is Sarah, my wife. This is our house before it was painted green, and this is my ring. The woman hesitantly took the photo, examining it curiously. Her eyes widened as she recognized the house, but she remained skeptical. The resemblance is striking, said the man, looking from the portrait to Robert, but that doesn't prove anything. Stories of soldiers pretending to be dead to exploit families are not uncommon after war. The words hit him like a blow. They thought he was an imposter, a predator after a hero's widow. I would never do that, he stammered, revulsion almost knocking him over. A shaky voice cut through the tension. My God, Bobby Hayes, is that you, son? It was Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor, crossing the garden with a cane. She had known him since he was a child, had taken care of him while his parents worked. Mrs. Peterson, Robert whispered, relieved. She approached, her crinkled eyes studying him. He touched his face with a trembling hand. "They said you died," he said, his voice breaking. "Sarah got the telegram. There was a memorial. Your name is on the monument." "I was captured," he explained, tears streaming. "Prisoner. I was in the hospital for months before they identified me." The couple now watched, astonished, re-evaluating everything. "Where's Sarah?" asked Robert, holding Mrs. Peterson's hands like an anchor. Her expression turned dark. Sarah suffered greatly. She waited months, refusing to believe the telegram. She said she felt you alive, but little Bobby became seriously ill last winter. Pneumonia. Robert's heart stopped. His son, whom he had never met, fighting for his life. "Thomas Blake saved him," she continued. "He got penicillin. He and Sarah got married last spring. They took the boy to Denver." Robert felt the world fall apart. Thomas, his best friend, married to Sarah, his son calling him father. "I need to go to Denver," he said, his voice hoarse. "They deserve to know I'm alive." Mrs. Peterson shook his hand. "Think about it, Bobby. They're married. Little Bobby sees Thomas as his father. Sometimes the past should stay in the past." But he shook his head. "They deserve the truth. I deserve to say goodbye if I have to. Have you ever imagined discovering that your life has become a lie?" As Robert said goodbye, a new battle began, regaining his existence. He didn't know the worst was yet to come. The truth has the power to liberate, they say. But for Robert Hayes, the truth was a prison whose walls tightened with each new discovery. In the 24 hours following the shocking encounter in his former home, he wandered Ashland like a ghost, piecing together the shattered fragments of his former existence. At the local bank, the manager, a man who played poker with his father every Sunday, initially refused to recognize him. Only after an hour of intense discussion and the intervention of a former teacher, Mr. Garrison, did Robert gain access to what was left of his bank account. Technically, these funds were transferred to his wife after his death was reported, the manager explained, clearly uncomfortable. "She withdrew most of it, but left approximately $43. I assume she forgot that amount. $43. The approximate value of your last Army pay letter, the amount that, ironically, would pay exactly for a train ticket to Denver. At the post office, the situation was even more surreal. All letters addressed to Robert J. Hayes had been marked deceased return to sender for nearly a year. His name was officially on the list of deceased citizens of the county. "It's like they killed me with a stamp," he muttered to himself as he walked out of the post office building. It was at the city clerk's office that Robert finally understood the full extent of his elimination. Not only had his status been changed to deceased in all official records, but the house he had built itself had already undergone 2 ownership transfers. Sarah had sold her to the Wilsons 6 months after receiving the telegram, who in turn sold her to the current couple 4 months earlier. "What about the body?" Robert asked the clerk at the registry office, who was now looking at him with a mixture of fascination and horror. "If they declared me dead, there should be a body." The woman consulted the records again, adjusting her glasses nervously. According to military documentation, Sergeant Hayes, his body was never recovered due to the extreme conditions of combat. The memorial held at the Ashland Baptist Church in July 1944 was a symbolic funeral, a funeral without a body, an empty grave. Robert felt a strange sensation of vertigo. Somewhere in this city, there was a grave with his name on it. Though his feet still touched the ground, his heart still beat, his lungs still breathed. In the local cemetery, he found confirmation of this bizarre reality, a simple granite tombstone next to his parents' graves, Robert James Hayes, 1920-1944. Son, husband, hero killed in combat France. And, to her utter dismay, there were fresh flowers on the grave. White daisies, Sarah's favorite. Someone had been there recently, paying homage to a memory that now walked among the living. The elderly cemetery worker, noticing his prolonged presence in front of the tombstone, approached cautiously. "Did you know him, son?" he asked sympathetically. Robert almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Yes, Mum. You could say I knew him very well." "Poor young man," the lady continued, oblivious to the dramatic irony of the situation. "His wife used to come every week. She cried so much it broke anyone's heart. After he moved away, his best friend's mother, Blake I think his name was, started bringing flowers regularly. She said it was the least she could do, since her son was now looking after the deceased's family." The mention of Thomas Blake and his mother, sparked a new question in Robert. Did Thomas know? Did you ever suspect that Robert might be alive? They had grown up together, shared every secret, every dream. Thomas knew Robert better than anyone, except maybe Sarah. "Does Mrs. Blake still live in town?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Ah, yes, same house as always on Elm Street. She's one of the few who still keeps in regular contact with young Mrs. Hayes. I mean, Mrs. Blake now. They call every week, as far as I know." Robert thanked him and walked away, his mind processing this new information. Mrs. Blake could be his link to Denver, with Sarah, with your son. If he could convince her of his identity, perhaps she could help him get in touch in a less traumatic way than simply showing up on their doorstep. But first there was one more stop to make, a visit that, although painful, was necessary to complete his understanding of the life he had lost. On the monument to the fallen, erected in the center of the Yao main square, Robert found his name engraved in shining bronze, fifth from top to bottom on the left column. Robert J. Hayes, followed by his rank and unit, a hero among heroes, a dead among the dead. As he contemplated his own name immortalized in metal, a man approached. Sheriff Johnson, older and grayer than Robert remembered, but still with the same piercing gaze and authoritative stance. "You're causing a stir in town, son," he said without preamble. "Half the people think you're a ghost. The other half think you're an imposter, trying to take advantage of the Hayes tragedy." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" asked Robert, without looking away from his name on the monument. "Well, I've known you since you were a boy, and you knocked down my fence chasing one of your father's calves," the sheriff replied with a slight smile. "I know it's you, Bobby. What I don't know is how the hell you're alive when the U.S. Army said you were dead." Over the next few hours, sitting in the sheriff's office, Robert explained everything. The battle in France, the bombing that killed most of his unit, how he was presumed dead when in fact he had been captured by the Germans with serious injuries. Como remained in a prison camp until his release, but due to his injuries and subsequent typhoid fever, he remained unidentified for months in a field hospital. How, when he finally regained enough strength to establish his identity, the bureaucratic error was so deeply embedded in the system that no one bothered to properly correct it. "They sent the telegram about my death without a body," he concluded bitterly. "But when they discovered he was alive, they didn't send a telegram correcting the error. Apparently, resurrecting soldiers causes more administrative problems than killing them." The sheriff listened silently, occasionally taking notes. When Robert finished, he sighed deeply. "It's a hell of a situation, Bobby. Legally, you're dead. Your assets have been transferred. Your wife has remarried. Your son is being raised by another man. To reverse all of this, we'd need lawyers, court hearings, a lot of paperwork." "I don't want to reverse everything," Robert interrupted, surprising even himself with the statement. "I just want you to know that I'm alive. I just want to meet my son." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, gauging the sincerity in his eyes. "And what are you going to do when you get to Denver? Knock on their door and say, 'Surprise, I'm not dead'? Have you ever thought about what that would do to Sarah? To the boy?" Robert lowered his head. Of course he had thought of that. "I couldn't think of anything else." "I need to at least try," he finally said. "I can't just disappear. Not after everything I've been through to come back." For those of you who are wondering what you would do in this situation, imagine you fought, bled, and almost died for the chance to return home, survived the unthinkable only to discover that his life continued without you, that you have become expendable, replaceable. Would you be able to just turn your back and disappear, or would you fight to recover at least a fragment of what was rightfully yours? The sheriff finally nodded, recognizing the unwavering determination in the young soldier's eyes. "I'm going to contact a friend of mine in Denver, another sheriff. Maybe he can help locate Thomas and Sarah without causing too much of a fuss. In the meantime, I suggest you visit Mrs. Blake. She deserves to know you're alive, and maybe she can offer some advice on how to proceed." Robert thanked him and got up to leave. At the door, the sheriff called him one last time. "Bobby, just one more thing. Have you considered the possibility that maybe Sarah and Thomas are happy together? That the boy is fine as he is? Sometimes the bravest act is not to fight for what we want, but to give it up for the good of others." The sheriff's words followed Robert as he walked through the town he once called home, a city where he was now a stranger, a ghost, an anomaly. For every person who recognized him and reacted with shock, there were 3 who looked at him with suspicion or even fear. While heading to Mrs. Blake, an inescapable truth was beginning to crystallize in his mind. Even if he could legally prove he was alive, even if he found Sarah and her son, the life he knew before the war was gone forever. He had been erased, not just from the official records, but from the fabric of the community, from the lives of those he loved. The war had taken more than years from his life. He had stolen his very existence. But there was still one last hope, one last chance to regain something of what I had lost, and everything would depend on what would happen when he finally found Sarah, Thomas, and the son he never knew. What Robert didn't yet know was that his real battle was just beginning, and that the next 72 hours would require more courage from him than all his days at the front combined. Mrs. Blake's house was as Robert remembered it, a log cabin on Elm Street, vines on the walls, roses in the garden. There, he and Thomas built forts and swore blood oaths at the age of 12, promising to always protect each other. "I kept my promise, Thomas," thought Robert bitterly as he approached the door. "I wrote from the front to reassure you. I asked you to look after Sarah if anything happened to me, and you did so well that you made her your wife." The pain was irrational. He knew. Thomas had believed in his death like everyone else. There was no betrayal planned, just life moving on. Still, the resentment burned. The door opened before he knocked. Mrs. Blake, grey-haired with the same gentle childhood smile, stood still, hands over her mouth. "My God, Bobby Hayes." "Hello, Mrs. Blake," he said softly. She advanced, touching his uniform as if it were an apparition. "It's not possible," he murmured, eyes teary. "The telegram, the funeral. I was captured," Robert explained. "They declared me dead by mistake. Can I come in?" In the room, surrounded by family photos, he told his story. Survival, prison, hospital, returning to a life that was no longer his. Mrs. Blake listened silently, wiping away tears. "Bobby, it's like a biblical tragedy," he said at last. "I need to find them," he stated. "Sarah, Thomas, my son. They're in Denver at the Henderson Auto Shop. I need the address." She hesitated, looking at a photo on the wall. Thomas, Sarah, and a boy, your son. Sarah's eyes, but her chin, her brown hair, her smile were his. "He looks like you," she admitted. "Thomas says he sometimes sees you in him." Robert swallowed the lump in his throat. "Did they keep the name?" "Robert Thomas Hayes, Bobby Jr. Turned 4 last month. 4 years lost. First steps, words, smiles, stolen by a mistake." "Are they happy?" he asked, almost unwillingly. "Sarah suffered a lot," she replied. "Thomas took care of her and the boy, first as a friend, then..." The heart moves on. "They are building a life in Denver." It wasn't what he wanted to hear, but it was the truth. "I need the address," he insisted. She went to a desk and came back with a paper. 1482 Larimer Street, apartment 3B, he said reluctantly. They wanted a new beginning, away from the memories. "How will I get there?" he asked. "I have $43. All I have left." Mrs. Blake took his arm. "Thomas is my son, but you are also like a son to me. Promise to think about little Bobby's well-being first." The truth hit him. His son was an innocent victim. "I promise," he said. She picked up a box. "I sold my jewelry years ago. This is for room and board. You deserve it." He handed him $60. "Thank you," murmured Robert, putting away the money and the ring. Before leaving, he handed over his letters and medals. "Show it to Mrs. Peterson and the sheriff. Maybe they can bring me back to life legally." She nodded. "You will always have a home here." The train to Denver was leaving tomorrow. At the hotel, Robert wrote to his son, "Dear Bobby Jr., I dreamed of you every night in the war. Your smile kept me alive. Your father loves you more than anything." He kept the letter with the ring, ready for the battle of his life, making sure his son knew the truth. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come. 3 days. That's how long Robert spent on a train packed with returning soldiers, families moving west in search of post-war opportunities, and businessmen, enjoying the economic boom that followed the end of the conflict. 3 days of landscapes passing by the window, of polite conversations with strangers who had no idea of the turmoil in their hearts, of sleepless nights in uncomfortable seats. Denver appeared on the horizon on the morning of the 3rd day, a vibrant city breathing post-war optimism. New buildings were rising everywhere, the streets pulsed with renewed energy, and signs proclaimed, "Heroes welcome," for returning veterans. Robert watched it all with a strange sense of dislocation. This was a world that had gone on without him, not just his family, but all of civilization. From the train station, he went directly to the Henderson Auto Shop. "I wasn't ready for the final confrontation, not yet. First, I needed to see it." confirming with her own eyes that Sarah, Thomas, and little Bobby were real, not just names on a piece of paper or figures in a distant photograph. The workshop was on a busy commercial street, a red brick building with large garage doors open to reveal mechanics working on various vehicles. Robert positioned himself across the street, partially hidden by the entrance to a hardware store. From there, I had a clear view of the workshop without being easily noticed. Waited. 1 hour. 2. The summer sun beat down on his uniform, which was beginning to look out of place among civilians. Some passers-by gave him curious looks, probably wondering why a soldier would be standing there for so long. But Robert barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the workshop, studying each person who entered or left. And then, just after noon, he saw it. A small, fenced courtyard at the back of the workshop, invisible from the main street but perfectly visible from its elevated vantage point. A blonde woman sits on a bench with a picnic basket, watching a little boy playing with metal cars on the dirt. Sarah, and your son. Robert's heart felt like it was about to explode. Sarah was thinner than he, remembered, but she still had that elegant posture that had enchanted him from day one. And the boy? The boy was his reflection. The same dark hair, the same stubborn chin, the same way he frowns when he concentrates on something. As he watched, paralyzed by mixed emotions, Thomas left the workshop. He wiped his hands on a cloth before approaching Sarah and kissing her softly on the forehead. Then he bent down, lifted the boy into the air, and spun him around, causing loud, joyful laughter that Robert could hear even from a distance. A family, happy, complete, whole. No room for ghosts. That night, summoning all his courage, Robert knocked on the door of apartment 3B on Larimer Street. Thomas answered, and for an eternal moment, the two men who had grown up as brothers stared at each other, a ghost and his replacement, united and divided by a cruel fate. "Bobby," whispered Thomas, his face pale as if he had seen an apparition, which, in a sense, he had. "Oh my God, it's not possible." "Hello, Thomas," Robert replied, his voice strangely calm. "Can I come in? We need to talk." What followed was one of the most extraordinary and painful conversations ever held. Two friends separated by war and fate, reunited under the most impossible circumstances. "She can't see you like this," Thomas said after hearing the whole story. "Not suddenly. The shock could. Bobby, she almost died when she got the telegram. It took me months to convince her to eat again, to smile. And the boy?" Robert asked, his voice breaking. "He's his image," Thomas admitted. "Sometimes I look at him and see you, like a part of you has survived." They talked for hours about the unthinkable, about how to repair what fate had destroyed, about rights and duties, about a boy who deserved stability. "I need you to promise me something," Thomas said finally. "Think about them first. What's best for Sarah, for the boy?" Robert was silent for long minutes before asking the question that would change everything. "Are they happy, Thomas, truly happy?" "Yes, Bobby," Thomas replied, looking directly into his friend's eyes. "It wasn't easy. Sarah cried for you for months. She looked out the window every night waiting. But eventually, life went on, and little Bobby needs stability." Robert felt every word like a blade in his heart, thinking about Sarah crying, waiting for a return that would never happen. His son, growing up without knowing him. "Just let me see him," he requested, his voice barely audible. "Just once, up close. I don't need to talk to him, I only need to see my son once in my life." Thomas hesitated, but agreed. The next morning, I would take little Bobby to the park. Robert could watch them from a distance. And so it was. From a bench away, Robert watched as Thomas pushed his son on the swing. The boy laughed, throwing his head back just like Sarah, as he shouted, "Louder, Daddy, louder!" Every daddy addressed to Thomas was a small death for Robert. But the pure joy on his son's face, that carefree smile, those trusting eyes, crystallized something inside him. A painful but absolute certainty. That night he wrote 3 letters, one to Sarah, one to Thomas, and one to his son, to be delivered when he was older. In the letter to his son, he wrote, "There are things in life more important than our own desires. There are sacrifices we make, not because we are weak, but because we love too much. You will never know me, but I want you to know. Every day, away from you was torture. Every moment I survived was for you. And now my last act of love is to give you the peace and stability you deserve." For Sarah and Thomas, he left clear instructions. It would not interfere in their lives. I wouldn't dispute his dead status. It would not disturb the happiness they had built from the ashes of tragedy. He only asked that, when the time was right, they deliver his letter to his son, so that he would know the truth, so that he would understand the sacrifice. Robert Hayes officially never returned from the war. Legally, he remained dead, a name on a memorial, a legend few believed. He moved to a small town in Oregon, took on a new name, and made a modest living as a carpenter. The skills he used to build a home for his family were now used to create homes for strangers. He never remarried. He never had other children. He carried only one photo in his wallet, the same weathered image of Sarah that kept him alive during the war. The letters he left behind were kept as treasure. Sarah cried for days after reading it, understanding the magnitude of the sacrifice. Thomas honored his promise to care for Robert's family as if it were his own, because now it was. And little Bobby? He grew up strong and determined with the same intense look as his biological father. At 18, he received Robert's letter and the complete truth about the man whose blood ran through his veins, about the soldier who had made the ultimate sacrifice, not just risking his life in war, but giving up his very existence for love. The letter contained no bitterness, just unconditional love and an explanation of what it means to be a hero. Not someone who wins battles, but someone who puts the happiness of others above their own. You had two parents who loved you, Robert wrote, one who gave his life for you before you even met him, and another who was there for every important moment. Honor them both. Without informing anyone, the young man began a search for the man who had given up everything for him, a search that lasted years, until, on a rainy afternoon, he knocked on the door of a simple house in Oregon. A white-haired man answered, his eyes still carrying that same silent determination. "Hello," he said simply. "My name is Robert Hayes, Jr." The old soldier felt his legs weaken. In all these years, he never imagined this moment. You found me," he whispered. "Yes," replied the young man with the same half-smile as the Hayes. "A soldier always fulfills his mission. I learned that from both my parents." That night, father and son talked until dawn, about impossible choices and silent sacrifices, about true heroism. Thomas and Sarah were informed days later. There was no anger, just a recognition that some stories are too complex for simple judgments. That love takes many forms, some almost incomprehensible in their purity. Bobby Jr. built a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. He visited Robert regularly, bringing photographs, stories, pieces of his lost life. At Bobby Jr.'s college graduation, 3 people watched him with pride: Sarah, Thomas, and an elderly man sitting discreetly in the back row. Robert Hayes, the soldier who returned from the war and discovered he was dead. None of them were conventional heroes, just ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances, doing the best they could with the cards fate had dealt them. And perhaps that's what makes this story so powerful. Because in the end, it's not the grand gestures that define us. These are the small daily choices, the willingness to sacrifice, the courage to love, even when it hurts, the strength to keep going when all we want is to go back. Robert Hayes, officially dead but stubbornly alive, teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting for what we want, but giving it up for the sake of those we love. A lesson as relevant today as it was in 1945. This is the story the War Department never wanted told. The story of a man who came back from the dead only to discover that sometimes remaining a ghost is the greatest act of love possible. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of the true meaning of heroism. You have just witnessed one of the most extraordinary narratives ever revealed, a story that goes beyond the battlefields and into the heart of the human condition. Robert Hayes is not just a soldier, he is a symbol of love that transcends death, of sacrifice that defies all understanding. Imagine the weight of such a devastating choice, giving up your own existence for the sake of those you love. Every second of this story is a direct challenge to what we thought we knew about courage, love, and identity. It's not just a historical account, it's a mirror that forces us to question what we would do in impossible circumstances. Your voice can make a difference. Now share in the comments the moment that hit you the most. Every word is a tribute to the silent heroes, every reflection a bridge between the past and the present. Your perspectives have the power to transform an individual story into a collective movement of understanding and respect. A simple tap on the like button is more than a click. It's an act of recognition. It's giving visibility to stories that have been deliberately silenced. It's amplifying voices that the world has tried to erase. Each like resonates like a cry of recognition, echoing through generations. This is not just a community of spectators, but a movement dedicated to unearthing forgotten truths, to honoring ignored sacrifices. Your registration is a commitment to memory, to truth, to humanity in its purest and most transformative form. Sign up now and become part of something bigger. The next video promises to reveal stories that will challenge everything you thought you knew. Buried secrets, unthinkable sacrifices, narratives that blur the lines between heroism and humanity. Get ready for an experience that goes beyond entertainment. It will be a journey of personal discovery.